Okay, good afternoon and welcome back. So we're on our fourth day of the conference lectures. So this is our fourth day where we have two lectures today. One is here with Debbie Muntasser, and then the next one will be at Bolt Law School at 7 p.m. So we're going to pull out from here and walk up there. So this is the way to get exercise and part of the California Diet Program. So today's lecture is Debbie Muntasser, who just actually landed from New York earlier today, Washington, D.C., just for this event to participate. She's an internationally recognized award-winning educator, speaker, and authority on cross-cultural understanding. She's a community leader in New York area, where currently they're actually leading a boycott campaign against the Washington Post, not the Washington Post, the New York Post newspaper that had the Ilhan Omar tagline, was showing the Twin Towers. So this is actually a campaign that is ongoing, and they have had some good footprint among the communities that are involved in this. So there is actually proactive work in there. Dr. Muntasser is the founding and former principal of Al Khalil Gibran International Academy in Brooklyn, New York. 25 veteran of the New York City public school system. She survived that, and that in itself is a challenge. She taught special education, inclusion, trained teachers in literacy, and served as a multicultural specialist and diversity advisor. So the full bio is there. But recently she published Leading While Muslim, the experience of American Muslim principles after 9/11. So she will speak about her major theme and some of the challenges that have faced Muslims in relations both to 9/11, which continues to be with us today. So please welcome Debil Muntasir to the podium.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace and greetings, everyone. I'm so honored and humbled to be here. Thank you so much, Dr. Hatem. This is actually my first time to Berkeley, so I'm really excited. I'm also excited to see so many people here. Dr. Hatem mentioned to you that we are leading a boycott against the New York Post. How many people know the New York Post? Raise your hand. Okay, that's really good. So the New York Post is the equivalent of the Inquirer on a national level, except that it basically reports about just your ordinary citizens, and they basically sensationalize things, and of course about elected officials. So last week, as Dr. Hatem mentioned, that they actually took Representative Ilhan Omar's quotes out of a speech that she gave at CARE. A CARE banquet in mid-March, and they actually juxtaposed them to the Twin Towers. And you could only imagine the outrage that created in New York City, both for Muslims and non-Muslims, because it's such a sensitive thing for us as New Yorkers to see something like that. And so we were all so emotionally disturbed by it that we were like, we have to do something. So I'm actually one of the founders of the Yemeni American Merchants Association, which is an organization that was birthed out of the Yemeni bodega strike. I don't know how many of you followed that back in February of 2007. It was in resistance to the Muslim ban, where we shut down 1,000 Yemeni stores. And then we had a huge rally outside in Brooklyn Borough Hall, where we had over 6,000 Yemeni Americans and allies come out. It made international headlines, so you can actually just search Yemeni bodega strike, and you'll see a gazillion things come from that. And so our membership basically said, we want to do something. And we said, well, what would you like to do? And their response was, we're not going to carry this paper anymore. So we called 10 influential leaders, business leaders, within the New York City area. We presented this idea from the membership, and they're like, we're in full support. We want to do this. Let's make this happen. We issued a press release on Friday that it was effective as of April 13th. We're giving the New York Post 30 days to do the 4 following things. We had a press conference on Sunday. The first is to apologize to Representative Ilhan Omar, the American Muslim community, and communities of color that they victimized over the years. The second demand is to have journalists integrity in reporting factually and accurately without sensationalizing and tabloiding the stories of peoples and individuals to sell paper. The third, we asked for the resignation or the firing. I like to use the word firing better because we don't want him to simply do it. We want the paper itself to force him out, to fire the editor-in-chief, Stephen Lynch. And then the fourth demand is actually to all elected officials, local and national, not to provide the New York Post with a platform to report. So we're giving them 30 days to come clean with the apology to our communities. And if we don't hear back from them within the 30 days, we are going forward with an onslaught campaign to basically take down the New York Post. So just for all of you here, I know that some of you are probably organizers and you're online. We have a Launch Good campaign. If you can donate $1, $5, $10, please do so. Just look for it in Launch Good. The hashtag is boycott New York Post. So help us. This is a huge effort to take on, but we are ready for the challenge. We are ready to defend the rights of individuals, no matter where they come from, what religion, what nationality, what ethnicity, what racial background they are. We are not going to let hate spread across our nation. What they did to Representative Ilhan Omar, what they did to me in 2007, which I'll tell you my story, cannot continue to happen because they are endangering the lives of individuals by the way that they're reporting, as well as Fox News. So on that note, now I'm going to put on my academic professional hat. So thank you all for letting me give you that little presentation about our latest campaign. So Dr. Hatem introduced me and introduced the book, Leading While Muslim. This book is actually a labor of love that was actually turned from a dissertation into a book. Now, how many of you are graduate students here? Raise your hands. How many of you are PhD students? Raise your hands. Oh, I feel you guys. I feel you. I know what that feels like. You're going to get through it, I promise. If I got through it, you're going to get through it. So when I was doing my research, it was one of the most grueling things, but it was also one of the most rewarding things. As you will hear in my presentation, my research was actually inspired by my own personal story. My personal story is I'm the founding principal of the Khalil Gibran International Academy, which is the first Arabic dual language public school in the United States. The school was actually announced in February of 2007. Once the school was announced, the blogosphere went viral with it and started calling the school a madrasa, and that we were going to actually be training homegrown terrorists in New York City, and that it was going to be a school to indoctrinate children. And so it was outrageous to hear these things that were created about this school on the blogosphere, but even worse were the local papers and the things that they started to write. So in one of the local papers called the New York Sun, Daniel Pipes, how many of you know Daniel Pipes? Raise your hand. All right. Oh, wow, only a couple of people do. All right, y'all need to know who Daniel Pipes is. You got homework tonight. Research Daniel Pipes. Daniel Pipes is one of the Islamophobia industry masters who runs the Middle East Forum. He actually wrote an article titled, "A Madrasa Grows in Brooklyn." How many people read a book titled A Tree Grows in Brooklyn? Okay, one person, but at least, okay, a couple of people, good. Can you believe this, that he wrote A Madrasa Grows in Brooklyn? So he basically started to editorialize about the school, and paper after paper started to pick it up. A small group of people collectively came together and called themselves the Stop the Madrasa Coalition. Yes, I'm not kidding, the Stop the Madrasa Coalition. And so what this group did was they traveled all over the city, they combed the entire internet, and they tried to find anything that I may have said or done. They found articles, which actually I was interviewed and quoted in. Prior to the school, I was an activist. I was one of the very first voices talking about the detentions and deportations in the aftermath of 9/11. I was holding our government, accountable for the things that it was doing under the Patriot Act. There was a lot of things that I was doing that I actually had a footprint in print media. So they started to take my quotes out of context and portray me as anti-American. They started to find pictures of me in the internet wearing my hijab in very different ways, and they put them all together. And they wrote a caption that was titled Islamist Leftist. I had never even heard of the two together. Oxymoron, right? So these pictures, they showed me of wearing hijab to the front, no makeup, no jewelry, and then other pictures that showed me with makeup and jewelry and my headscarf a different way. It was crazy, but they were so infatuated with taking me down that they did not stop at all. They were following me all over the city. They would come to fairs where we were actually recruiting parents to sign their children up. And they would be in the audience ready to ask questions. And questions that they used to ask were, are you going to separate the girls from the boys? Are you going to be leading prayers in the school? Are you going to have a halal kitchen? Are you going to be closing the school for your holidays? It was crazy. Are your maps going to have Israel on the map? And every question that they asked me, I would say to them, this is a New York City public school. We're going to abide by the same calendar. We're going to have the same food. The children, the Muslim children that are going to attend the school will continue to eat tuna fish and cheese for the rest of their life. And our maps are the same maps that everyone is using. Regardless, they were determined. They were holding press conferences, rallies to try to shut down the school. They found out that I actually was a person in New York who spearheaded Arab Heritage Week. And they found the listing of all the events that were taking place that year. And they went to each and every event hoping to find me there to be doing something, I don't know what. But I didn't go to any of those events because I was busy trying to open up a school. So the last event that they got to, they found a table that had t-shirts. And one of the t-shirts on that table read Intifada NYC. They took a picture of the t-shirt. They went home, they did research on the organization who developed the t-shirts. They found that this organization was sharing space with an organization which I sit on the board of, and they made this tenuous connection that I was responsible for the t-shirt. They put out a press release. The media started calling the New York City Department of Education. They called me, and the press person says to me, we're getting calls right now about a t-shirt that says Intifada on it. Can you help us understand what this Intifada business is? And I was like, I don't even understand. Intifada? Like, she's like, okay, let me spell it for you. So of course she spelled it for me. I was like, oh, you mean Intifada? And then I explained to her what it was, and I said to her, it has nothing to do with me or the school. This is an organization that is in the community that does youth empowerment, but there's no involvement here, and there's no story here. They call up all the media outlets, and they let them know. Everybody was like, okay, thank you, false alarm here. But the New York Post didn't take no for an answer. They were determined to write a story. So this happened probably like on a Thursday, and they were brewing with this story. The DOE would call me and say they're going to do a story. Do you want to talk? I'm like, no, absolutely not. I'm not going to talk to the Post. No way, no how. Eventually, the DOE caved, and they ended up making me speak, even though I told them I did not want to. And I agreed to actually responding to questions. So I responded to the questions. This was a Sunday afternoon. The press person that was working with me was actually at her father's birthday party and trying to be with family and trying to do work. It just didn't all happen. So what ended up happening, she calls me up at 4 o'clock. She's like, they have a 4:30 deadline. We'll just get on the phone. I wasn't able to do the questions. We'll do the interview. I'll be with you. If they get out of line, I will actually stop them, and we're just going to end the interview. We do the interview. We both thought everything was fine. The things that I said on the record went on the record, and what have you. The next day, the article read, Muslim principal revolting. They portrayed me as minimizing the historical context of the Intifada, which actually made the entire Jewish establishment in New York City go crazy. They started calling the mayor's office, the DOE. Within 4 days, they ended up forcing me out of my position. That's how crazy the New York Post is. The day of my forced resignation, when I submitted the letter, because they gave me an ultimatum. It was either you step down or the school is not going to open. And I did not want to interrupt this historical moment of having the first Arab American school, public school, teaching the story and heritage and history of Arab Americans in the United States. The front page of the New York Post read, "Shake up," and they spell the word shake, S-H-E-I-K-H. And my face was plastered there. And then, of course, they wrote additionally that I was, that I stepped down because of my words. And it's a very long story, and I don't want to get drowned in this story. You can read about it. The New York Post. The New York Times actually did an expose on me. It was 2.5 pages long. They also did videos. In 2008, it came out, an incredible story. I always joke about this. I'm actually the first Arab and Muslim to be on the front page of the New York Times in a positive way. Because usually the people that are there have done something horrific if they make it on the front. So you can read the whole thing. There's also videos that were created about me and my story. One of them is titled Intifada NYC. You can actually get it on Netflix and Amazon. And then the other one is an HBO special, which a lot of universities are using to talk about First Amendment. And that one is titled Shouting Fire, Stories from the Edge of Free Speech, that you can actually watch and learn more about it. There's been a lot written about my story, articles as well as people written about me in journals, etc., so you can have a good sense. Why I tell you this story is because it inspired me to find out about the stories and the lives of other American Muslim educators in public education to see whether or not the political discourse, the global events, and the media coverage were affecting their spirituality and their leadership. Sadly, what I found out is that they were affected in some shape, way, or form, some more than others. Within this study, there are actually 14 principles. I started with 20, but only 14 agreed to participate on a national level. What does that tell you about us as a nation, that there are only 20 American Muslim public school leaders across the country? In New York City, we have 22% of Muslims across the U.S. residing in New York City, and we only have a couple. Sadly, those couple were afraid to be a part of my research because of retribution. They were afraid that the DOE would retaliate against them. And they, in fact, wrote me back and said, please don't call us or email us. We don't want to have anything to do with you or your research. I didn't take it personally because I knew how terrified they were to be put in any position. Within this study, there are 6 men and 8 women. 6 are African American. There are 3 women and 3 men. 6 are actually Arab American, 4 women and 2 men. And in the Arab diaspora, there are actually one who's from Yemen, a couple from Syria, Egypt, and Palestine. Another is from Tanzania, from Indian descent, and 1 person from Pakistan. So my objective, as I mentioned earlier, was to really see what their lived experience was for them and what were the things that were impacting them as individuals within their school communities. Some of them were actually elementary school leaders, some of them were K to 8, and some of them were high school school leaders. The book actually features 4 individuals. If I wrote about all 14, my book would actually be 800 pages long. But I did not want to have a very long book. I wanted to have a short and concise book that people, once reading it, continue the dialogue about what is it that we as a nation need to do to make sure that this does not repeat itself against Muslims and against communities of color that are exercising their leadership. The 4 people that you see here are very interesting and have very interesting stories, and I'll briefly tell you some of the things that they experienced. The first person is actually Nejla. Nejla is actually from a Yemeni background. She started teaching pre-9/11, was teaching for several years. 9/11 happened, and she remembers that day vividly. Each and every one of them actually reflected on that day. She reflected about how that day she had the opportunity to go to the auditorium to see what everybody was doing in there, and found her colleagues actually watching the TV set. And when she asked them what they were watching, nobody responded to her right away. And as she was watching, she couldn't figure out what they were watching. One of them turned around to her and said, "We're watching the Twin Towers being taken down by Arabs and Muslims." And they all looked at her with looks that she felt were piercing through her. She was horrified by what she heard, immediately left the auditorium, ran back into her classroom, and told me that she actually crawled under her desk and started crying because she didn't know what to do at that moment. In the days and the weeks and the months after 9/11, everyone in the staff didn't treat her the way they did before. They were distant, they were cold, and she felt like they were blaming her for what had happened. As much as she tried to be herself, it was really uncomfortable for her. Eventually, things got better. She went into a leadership program because that was what she was aspiring to be, a school leader. And while she was going through the program, one of the administrators in her district said to her, "You know, Najla, if you really want to be a school leader, you really need to think about changing your wardrobe." That's basically code language for take your hijab off if you really want a job. And so Najla contemplated with this for the months after and eventually made the sacrifice for her career to sacrifice her faith and taking off the hijab. She finished the program, she became an assistant principal, became a principal, and now actually is an assistant superintendent in her district, but continues to feel very guilty that she had to make the choice of her career over her faith. Something that sadly is really unfortunate in a country that our country was created and based on religious freedom. When I interviewed Najla and I asked her, how does she feel? She said she feels guilty every day about the decision. And I asked her, well, have you thought about perhaps ever putting it back on? And she said, I do, but I'm so terrified at what the reaction of people would be, especially now with the heightened Islamophobia. That's Najla's story. The next story is actually Rula. Rula actually took over a school that was on the brink of shutting down, a charter school. The charter school board hired her. She actually brought the school back up. The first year was difficult, but the second year the school became an A grade. The third year became an A grade. And then the board decided to actually hire an executive director to help her with the administration and public relations so she can focus solely on teaching and curriculum. She was a part of the process of actually choosing the executive director. They interviewed a bunch of people. They narrowed it down to 2 people. And she went off on to summer vacation. She came back, and they actually hired an executive director. But sadly, it was not either of the 2 people that she was a part of the process. They hired a 9/11 family member. Her first encounter with this executive director went like this. They're sitting down, trying to get to know each other, and the executive director said to her, "Are you Muslim?" Because she was wearing hijab, but not to the front, to the back. "Is your husband Muslim? Are you a practicing Muslim?" Now, mind you, Rula knew that these kind of questions were illegal for your employer to ask you. You don't ask these kinds of questions. But she figured, you know what, let me win this woman over. She's going to be my boss. I love my job. I love what I do. I have to try to win her over and make this work. She answered those questions for her, but spent the entire year under duress, where this executive director, day after day, was chipping away at her leadership qualities, always making her feel inadequate, and microaggression after microaggression attacking her and her religion. I'll give you a small example. The executive director one day decided to bring in Italian sausages, and she was giving it out in the main office to all the staff. And she walks by Rula and says, "Oh, I can't give this to you. You don't eat pork. You don't know what you're missing." And then she walked away and kept giving it out. These are the kinds of things that Rula was experiencing. The boiling point was a day where she gave her permission to actually announce that she had gotten accepted to Harvard for a program, a professional development program. She announced it and then decided to get up, the executive director decided to get up and yell at her in front of the staff as to why is she boasting about herself. Rula was under so much duress that she immediately ran into her office, started to cry, and the next thing she found herself in a hospital. She passed out, EMS took her out. She was in the hospital for 2 weeks. The executive director didn't contact her. The school board didn't contact her. She eventually came out of the hospital, went back to work, sent the school board an extensive letter chronicling what she was experiencing throughout the school year. There was no response for them. On the last day of school, which every year she actually gets a letter inviting her back to sign a contract to leave the school. This time the letter was not an invitation. It was basically saying, we no longer want your services. I met Rula 2 years and 8 days after that experience. I wish I had met her, actually 2 years minus a day, so I could have actually given her a lawyer to file a lawsuit against the school board for all the things that they did to her. But in the state where she lives, you only have a 2-year window to actually be able to file. That's Rula's story. What Rula sadly ended up having from this trauma that she experienced was actually seizures for life, which now she has to take medicine every single day in order not to have seizures. The next person is actually Aziz. Aziz is really interesting. Aziz is African American. When he walks through the room, you could see authority radiate through this man. Very well-built, well-dressed, handsome man. When he walks in, all the eyes are on him. And the moment that he says, "My name is Aziz Mahmoud," he sees the puzzlement in people's faces and the confusion. And then he starts to feel what they are thinking. The perceptions that he is seeing, he basically feels it through the looks that he's getting and wonders, what are they thinking? Why are they thinking this? Etc. His story is really very heartbreaking as well. Aziz, 1 year, actually had a couple of Muslim staff that he hired. They came to him and they said to him, "We'd like to go make Friday prayer." Aziz himself used to go. He had the permission of his superintendent, and he did. Now, mind you, of all the 6 men, there were only 2 that were actually making their Friday prayers. All the others were too afraid to ask their superintendents to go make the Friday prayer. They simply didn't go. So he gave them permission. He created a flexible schedule for them to be able to do so. And then in addition to that, he had several number of Muslim children who actually wanted to go make the Friday prayer. They provided the permission slips. He gave them the authority to be able to go make their Jummah and come back to school. On a couple of accounts, he was actually seen walking out of the building with them. Someone decided to report him to his district leadership that he was actually promoting Islam. He was then under investigation for the entire school year. 1, for the fact that he was permitting the teachers, and 2, for walking the students. The investigators came, interviewed him, interviewed students, interviewed families, interviewed the staff. He was in turmoil that whole year and wondering, oh my God, am I going to have a job after this or not? That was how he was feeling. Eventually, he went in for his disciplinary hearing, and what they accused him of was that he was promoting Islam. And what they told him that he needed to do was, going forward, he is not to walk outside of the building and walk the children to the mosque. That he's to let them walk before him, or he should go before them, but he's not to interact with them in order to avoid that perception. Regarding the staff, they found nothing that he did illegal. Everything that he did was, up to standard, and they let it go. Sadly, that year he was supposed to actually get a $10,000 bonus for having excellent scores the year before last. And when I asked him, why didn't you ask for it? He said, you know what? After that experience, I just wanted to stay off the radar. I'd rather have my peace of mind and know that I have my job than have to worry about an additional $10,000. The sad and unfortunate thing for Aziz and his students is that he distanced himself from all of his Muslim students because he did not want to be seen as promoting Islam or offering them preferential treatment or anything that would actually put him in harm's way again for another investigation. And how sad and unfortunate it is for those kids to have somebody of their faith that they can look up to, that could be a role model for them, to simply push them aside and not want to have anything to do with them. And this was so bad for Aziz that even having any conversation about Islam and Muslims, he felt very uncomfortable. Rula also felt very uncomfortable. All of them, to an extent, never wanted to have any conversation about Islam or Muslims because they didn't know what they might say and how it might be perceived that can taint them or make people think that they are actually radical or, or extremist. So they figured the best way to avoid having anything like that be said about them was to not have any conversation about Islam or Muslims whatsoever. The last person, which is very interesting, is Aziz. When I contacted Aziz, his first response to me was, I don't think I'm the right Muslim for you. I was like, well, what is a right Muslim? What is a right Muslim? He's like, well, I don't pray. I don't go to the mosque. I don't fast. I don't do anything that Muslims do anymore. I was like, you're perfect. I want you to be a part of my study. He's like, I'm not, I'm not a good Muslim. I was like, I'm not going to judge you. I really want you to be a part of this study. So when I met with Ayman, it was very, very interesting as I went through all the questions with him and gave him a chance to speak. He sadly is one of those individuals who've allowed all of the negative things that are said about Islam and Muslims become a self-fulfilling prophecy. He was angry with Islam. He was angry with Muslims. He felt that all of these things that are happening to Muslims are their fault because they're not out there, they're not speaking up, they're not condemning violence, they're not condemning terrorism. And as I continued to, ask him questions, I learned that he was not connected to a Muslim community. He was all by himself. He didn't even know where his local mosque was. The people that he was around were people who thought this way, and he just simply internalized these things. And it was so difficult for me to actually sit there and hear all these things. And so after I did all the research and I submitted my dissertation and I defended and I graduated, I then sent him a letter thanking him and then a list of all of the links where you see, from clerics to scholars to organizations across the world issuing statements and the proactiveness of the American Muslim community just to show him that, no, actually, Muslims are doing a lot. I didn't hear back from him, but I felt it was my duty to help him see, there is really a good community out there trying to do the best. And so Ayman's story is very, very touching in that way because there are people out there who actually are feeling this way, who are thinking this way. And it's because of, hearing this over and over of how bad Islam is, how evil Islam is, that some people are starting to internalize this, sadly. So moving forward, I want to share with you the emerging themes within the study. So for those of you who are academics, the conceptual framework that I actually used was political spectacle. It's a theory developed by Murray Edelman. Anybody know Murray Edelman and political spectacle? Okay. So it's a very fascinating conceptual framework that basically talks about how everything and anything that generates news or generates tension is actually political spectacle. What we saw just last week with the New York Post and Ilhan Omar is political spectacle. What we saw with Donald Trump, I almost said President, Donald Trump, is political spectacle, right? He utilized her comments and videos and created this video to create hysteria and to get more people not to like her and to hate her and to discredit her and to really undermine her. What happens in political spectacle is that you always have two sides. One wanting to be the right one and to achieve whatever goals and objectives and agenda that they want. And so in this case, the people that were in this political spectacle were actually the American Muslim school leaders. And in every situation where they found themselves in either a conflict or in a situation where they were perceived in an adversarial way, that was political spectacle. Because it was what people were thinking about them that was basically being put onto them, like in the case of Rula and this 9/11 family member who had this deep-rooted hate for Islam and Muslims because of the loss of her brother. So within this, the school leaders actually talked about political climate was a major factor in the things that they were experiencing. And when I asked them to tell me more about it, what does that sound like? What does that look like? They believed that the political climate was filled with fear and hysteria that generated anxiety by the following: Al-Qaeda, ISIS, GOP, neoconservatives, white supremacists. Every time that there was something, it was always initiated by these groups. And when something happened by any of these groups, they felt the tension both on themselves as well as their counterparts, who also were feeling that anxiety from what they were hearing and learning. The second is actually the role of the media. They all said that they believed the media played a role in everything that's been happening. And they felt that the negative images of Islam and Muslims and the coverage of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, white supremacists, etc., were actually the things that were generating a lot of the negative things that were happening to them, the hate crimes that they were seeing, the backlash, the discrimination, etc. Now, interestingly enough, when I counted the word media from both interviews that I did with all of them, the word media came up 143 times, which was really fascinating. The next one is inferior and foreign. Each and every one of them talked about moments where they felt inferior and foreign by individuals within their district, by parents, by people outside, such as conferences. Everyone and anyone who didn't know them, and even their staff when they first went to that school, made them feel inferior and foreign, that they had to prove themselves. One of the female principals said that she had a parent that actually questioned her actually credentials, whether she had a master's, did she specialize in education, and it was really for her very, degrading to have to actually prove that she had the credentials to be where she was. And so these were ways that they felt inferior. Other ways that they felt inferior was not always being seen as if though they're just as good as their colleagues. The African American Muslim women who were actually in hijab, one of them said to me that she always felt that she had to prove herself 3 times more than her counterparts. And I asked her, can you please help me understand that? She said, well, I'm African American, I'm a woman, and I'm Muslim. You can't top all those 3. And I was blown away by that. And she's like, I have to prove myself 3 times more every time, that I'm just as good. And she shared how she saw this happening because another person that she knew within her district who was African American and had the last name Mohammed, that people were telling him to actually change his last name to make it a much more American name so that way it doesn't, create an obstacle career-wise. So it's pretty crazy to hear these kinds of stories of how people are being made to feel, inferior and foreign in their own skin. The next one is actually unconscious fear. Each and every one of them talked about moments of having this unconscious fear of losing their jobs based on their identities. Many of them talked about how every time that they were faced with anything that they were worried about controversy, they always thought twice about what came out of their mouth to avoid being seen as propagating Islam or to be seen as, radical, always self-checking and always trying to be politically correct, just so that way they don't get themselves in any kind of turmoil, which is really sad and unfortunate. The next one is actually spirituality. I talked about that earlier, and the reason that I wanted to see if their spirituality was being affected was because for those of us that are Muslim in the room, Islam is a way of life. Everything that you do is a part of your faith. Your service, your prayer, your intentions, everything is just a part of your faith. And so I wanted to see how these people were inspired by their faith and if they were actually able to observe within their school communities. The other thing that also inspired me was the African American experience. There is a great deal of literature on spirituality within the African American Baptist community that many African American Baptist educators actually find their faith as a source for leadership. And so that was also very inspiring for me to see about Muslims. Now, when I asked the question of these people, it was very interesting. As I mentioned to you earlier, some of them, sadly, the men, only 2 were actually going to make Friday prayer. The rest never asked for it. They were too afraid to ask for it because they didn't want to be on the radar. One in particular, gentleman, only one in his state, who did not want to ask for it, but he actually found a way around it. And I always get emotional when I tell his story. He actually found a mosque in his state that live streamed Jummah. And he would go in his office every Friday and he would tell his secretary, I'm going to go in my office. You are not to knock on the door or call me unless it's an emergency. And he would lock his door. He would turn on the TV. He would watch the khutbah. He would roll out his carpet, and he would make his Jummah. I thought that was the most inspiring thing to actually hear somebody talk about. That he did not let the obstacles of his job affect his spirituality. That was actually able to find a way to stay connected to his God and to his spirituality. It was just very, very moving when he shared this with me. But at the same time, why does this man have to go through all of this? Why can't he have his hour break to go to the local mosque and make his Jummah? In fact, why do all of them have to worry about having that opportunity, right? In a nation that was created on religious freedom. The other question that I asked them, and there was actually one other story I want to share that's within the research. One other principal that I asked about this, he said to me, he said, I want to go, but because my school is in a very dangerous neighborhood, if one of my children gets shot through a window, the headline tomorrow would not be a child was shot through a window. The headline would be a child was shot while this principal was at the mosque. He's like, that terrifies me to think about that, and I don't think I should go anywhere because I don't want to be put in that kind of situation. So these are the kinds of challenges that a lot of them were facing. Now, the other question I asked them was, for those of them who, majority of them said that their school community doesn't know if they pray or not, and they don't choose to pray publicly in their school. They don't really talk about it. They don't talk about Ramadan. They really try as much as possible not to engage in conversation about it. I asked them about their spirituality. If they were to rate themselves from 1 to 10, what they would rate themselves on a spiritual level. I want to go back to Ayman. Ayman's story was really interesting. When I gave him this, now mind you, he said he didn't pray, he didn't fast, he's not a Muslim, he really doesn't see himself affiliated with the community. He rated himself a 7. And I was like, this is really interesting. And of course my follow-up was, well, can you explain why you gave yourself a 7? He said, well, when I think back about my childhood, and my stepmother, who was British, who actually became Muslim before she married my father, the way that she actually observed Islam was very beautiful. She was very kind, she was very passionate, she believed in social justice, she was always there, and she really, really knew the religion very well, and she loved the religion. And so when I think of her and I think of that experience, that is my source of connection to being Muslim. And that's why I would give myself a 7. So I was like, this is really interesting. Others, it was across the spectrum. But I felt it was necessary to ask that question, especially to help understand in terms of prayer, if they pray, if they don't pray. And I really didn't dig deep and get very personal with them. It was very voluntary in terms of getting this information. And of course, making sure that I wasn't judgmental of any of them because it was so important to welcome them to be a part of this study. The next one is actually education over communication, education and communication over spectacle. This is really interesting. Though in their school buildings, they never found those teachable moments to teach people because they were too afraid to discuss it within their school communities. But outside their school communities, when an opportunity presented itself to educate and communicate with people over spectacle, they did. And I'll give you an example of one. One of the principals went on a boat ride with her husband with a group of other people, and she was wearing this beautiful floral silk scarf that was blowing in the wind. And there was this old white woman sitting on the boat, just watching her and watching the scarf. And then she said to her, your scarf is so beautiful. Did you wear it for this occasion? And she said, no, I wear it every day. So she started engaging her in a conversation. Why do you wear it? She told her. She's like, oh, wow, that's really interesting. How many colors do you have? What kind of texture fabrics do you have? It was just this beautiful conversation that this woman just wanted more information. That was an opportunity for her to actually educate, over the spectacle that we see all the time. And this woman just learned something really beautiful about Muslim women and hijab. So that's just one example of that. The minor findings that I also found in there, too, that I didn't mention here on the slide, but I'll mention here, is all of them felt that there was a sense of collective guilt that was being imposed on them by society. Every time that anything happened, they felt that the community at large, American Muslim community at large and globally, was always blamed and were very tired of this collective guilt that was happening. And just felt that, there has to be some way to educate people that this should not be happening to the Muslim community at the hands of a small few. The other actually is social responsibility. They felt that since 9/11 up into the time that I was doing this study, they felt that there was a great deal of civic engagement. And they cited different times in the past 15 years where they saw the community doing really amazing work. They cited the time of when the 3 Chapel Hill children were murdered, and how nationally the American Muslim community rose and did the Feed Their Legacy campaign, where they fed people all over the country. It was just really beautiful, all the things that they were naming and talking about. And one of the principals, which is really interesting, she actually runs a Facebook page that every day she puts dua there and hadith. And I said to her, I said, like, is it your name? She's like, no, I would never put my name. She's like, I just run it, but nobody knows it's mine. And that was really, really fascinating. She's like, I have like 10,000 followers that follow this, and just read the stuff that I put up there. So it was really fascinating. But what they shared in that regard was that the community is really integrating itself, and it's working really hard to be a part of the American fabric. And they were very happy to see that, and actually are encouraging within their own school communities the opportunity to do so. So, moving along. So what were the conclusions of the study? The conclusions are, as you see here, political rhetoric affects human interactions and the psyche of American Muslims in leadership positions. This is not just these school leaders, but when we talk on a national level and across sectors, this is actually something that I've heard people talk to me about. During the time that I was actually doing my research, I was going to conferences and meeting people and talking to them about my research. And this horrifying stories that I was hearing from people in different sectors, it was scary. One woman who actually worked in corporate America talked about being in a boardroom with her CEO, who was actually sitting at the head of the table saying Islamophobic things. And all she could do was shrink in her chair because she was too afraid to open her mouth. No one knew she was Muslim, and she wasn't about to say anything to him. And when I shared with her that I was doing this study, and she said to me, this has happened already, and I don't even know what to do. I don't know what to say. I said to her, I said, well, do any of your colleagues know that you're Muslim? And she's like, no, I've never told anybody. I said, well, maybe you should start talking just to the people that you have relationships with, that you have a trusting relationship with, a bond, that perhaps the next time that you guys are in the boardroom, someone will interrupt if someone is saying something Islamophobic. And so the objective here is that we need people to start interrupting the racism and bigotry that happens in our society. And that's really the objective of my writing this book. And when people actually invite me, like the invitations that I get from the American Muslim community, I get so many. And I'm like, okay, on the condition that 50% of your audience is non-Muslim. And they're like, huh? I'm like, yeah, because this book was really written for a non-Muslim audience. We all know what it feels like to be Muslim. And if you want to commiserate about all the horrible things that happen in our community, we could do that. But it's really important to engage people who are non-Muslim to actually learn and see what the experiences of American Muslims are. The next is Muslim religious identity plays a significant role in the job place, especially for those that are self-identifiable as Muslim. It definitely plays a role. American Muslims continuously forced to recognize the status of the other. This is when I was talking to you about them feeling inferior and foreign. Next, they actually believe that political correctness is vital to their performance as principals. That was always something that they did, even when they were thinking like, oh, I'm so angry I want to scream, but they don't, because they felt they needed to be politically correct. And last, American Muslim principals, especially those who are female, experience a strong sense of judgment and discrimination. especially those that are hijab wearing. So what are the recommendations? The recommendations from this study, but more importantly, the recommendations, or what I call the calls to action within the book, are the need for studies on American Muslim educators in public education. When I first started to do my literature review, I found absolutely nothing on American Muslim school leaders in public education. Nothing. All I found were articles about yours truly that were written about me during the time of the school. I found plenty of literature actually written about American Muslim school leaders and teachers within the Islamic school sphere, but nothing on public education. So it is imperative that there needs to be more studies on American Muslim educators in public education. Now, when I was doing my literature review, I started by looking at the African American experience, the Latinx experience, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans. I also did look at the European experience, as well as Catholics and Jews. And when I sat down with my advisor, and he said to me, he said, you know what, all of this is great, but what I'm seeing here is bigotry screaming out loudly here. And my advice is just to focus on bigotry, which only happens to faith communities. And what I've seen that you talk about here happening to Muslims in the last 20 years, and what's happened to Jews and Catholics when they first migrated to this country, it's very similar, and it's true. When I sat there and I was reading through the Catholic experience and the Jewish experience, and I would say to myself, oh my God, this is what's happening in my community right now. This is crazy. It's really crazy to see the things that Catholics and Jews experienced in the early 1900s when they first migrated here, in 1800s. So for those who are theologians, there's plenty of interesting facts to learn in my book about Catholics and Jews and their experiences. The next is research that provides Muslim educators with support and encouragement to seek principalship or school leadership. The fact that I only found 20 people across the nation of over 4 million American Muslims in the United States that are in public education as school leaders, that is an outcry as to why is it that number. There should be more school leaders from within the American Muslim community leading schools. There should be more African American individuals leading schools, more Latinx leading schools, more people of color leading schools. And that's a push that we need to push within our own communities and societies, that we have school leaders as well as educators that reflect the very diversity of our classrooms, because our children deserve to have role models from those communities. And so that's really critical to provide that kind of support. And this also talks about the encouragement of school districts as well as universities to recruit diverse communities to go into school leadership. Next is actually workshops focused on Muslims in America to encourage dialogue amongst the school communities. Every school district across this country that has American Muslim children in its schools should have these workshops, so they know and understand the very communities that they are supporting and representing. There should also be curriculum including the study of Islam and Muslims in America in every school district. I don't know how many of you are in education, but ethnic studies on a national level is under siege, and we have to save it and make sure that ethnic studies and religious studies continue. The National Social Studies Association in 2017 actually added a supplemental guide to the Common Core to make sure that religious literacy is actually being taught in our schools. And the reason they did so was to mitigate the bigotry that we saw happening across the country, especially after the presidential race. So it's there, but we have to educate school districts that they should actually incorporate it. Next is partnerships with organizations that conduct professional informational presentations on Islam. There are so many organizations doing this kind of work nationally. National Organization of American Muslim Principals and Assistant Principals. One of the questions I asked the principals was if there was an organization or some kind of association to provide them support, a support network, would they be interested? And they all actually said yes, except for one. When I asked him, well, can you explain why? He said, well, are you going to be a part of it? And I looked at him and I just smiled and I said, no, I don't think so. I'm not a principal anymore. And I pried and I was like, tell me, I want to know why you asked that question. He said, well, I was a little nervous because if you were, then I was thinking not to because, you know, of all the controversy that you faced, and I really don't want that to get drummed up. And, you know, and I was like, oh, awkward moment. I was like, okay, I'm not going to be a part of this. They all know of each other now. I hope that they will actually initiate something, but I think there is power in organizing. And if they organize and put something together, right now, which I'm really, really proud, in New Jersey, there's a couple of teachers that formed a group called Teaching While Muslim. And I actually presented with them last week, the founder at Rutgers. So she was a part of a panel discussion. So it's great, leading while Muslim, teaching while Muslim, we need it all. And then the last is policy, the need for policy work for American Muslim employees to actually be able to attend religious services on Fridays. If they can't ask for it, then it is our moral obligation as a society to fight for their right to have it. It's only an hour, and it's policy that we could actually get our school districts, our city councils, our, you know, cities as a whole to recognize this. I remember when I was growing up in Buffalo, New York, my Christian peers on Wednesday afternoon used to get picked up at 1 o'clock to go for religious services with public school busing. And they would go to their church for their religious services. The Jewish community in New York City, when daylight saving time, when the day is short, they actually get the opportunity to leave work early in order to be home before sundown. It's time that we help these school leaders, you know, have that opportunity to go and pray without having to feel like they're going to be seen as radical or, you know, anything of that sort, but just simply having the opportunity to observe their religious freedoms. So thank you all.
We have 10 minutes left
Oh
for
my gosh.
questions.
Yeah, and then signing my book. So the book is here, and I am actually selling it for $20. It's actually $26, but because I know you're all students and you're all struggling, it's going for $20. I'm happy to sign it. Yeah.
So let's take quick questions.
You should have timed me, Dr. Hatem.
Well,
You know
no.
us lecturers, you know, we just go on and on and on. Yes,
Thank you.
thank you.
I was listening to your lecture, and I was wondering to what end is all this? Is the idea that Muslims should be accepted into the United States and to get other people to see that, and then that's the end we're seeking? Is it that we seek other things like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and this new idea of how people should be voiced in the United States Congress and how they should be considered is very different than the status quo. So they're looking for something that's completely different. And it's not just acceptance, it's also bringing forth new ideas and new kinds of
absolutely.
ways of being respected. So I was wondering to what extent you're looking at that and what
Sure.
is the end. And
Sure.
just as a point, there's this thing among people who have served time in prison, this called being institutionalized. So at the end of that, people are literally dependent to be fed, to be taught, to be told what to do, and they respond in kind. And they don't imagine their own kind of freedom. I was wondering to what extent, among all of us, whether
Sure,
that
I'm
exists
happy
and
to
whether
answer that. And thank you for bringing up Ocasio-Cortez. She is truly an inspiration for all of us. I think that what I'm seeking is the social responsibility on both American Muslims as well as their allies and counterparts. We need to do it together, right? And what I mean by that is, I certainly don't want our allies to take the lead and lead on the efforts. We need to actually be leading those efforts and speaking and having a voice. And, you know, our liberation is contingent on the liberation of all people. And so it has to be a collective effort, but giving us the opportunity, centering our voices to make that change for our community. So I think it's critical that it happens in a combination of ways. And I think what Ocasio right now is doing to change the status quo is very much needed in our country. You know, from the White House to the schoolhouse. And we all have to really take responsibility for it, you know, and I think we can do it. I really think we could do it. I mean, you know, you weren't here earlier, but I was talking about the Yemeni bodega strike. The Yemeni American community has never been political, and the Muslim ban happened, and this sleeping giant woke up and now is politically organizing everywhere across the country. And just now, currently, are trying to take down the New York Post in New York City by boycotting it. So it's really about all of us having a place at the table and working collectively to make that change happen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for the presentation.
You're welcome.
And so my question is maybe not so from a political point of view, but from sociological point of view. So don't you think that this can be their own choice not to position themselves as public Muslims, so to say, to be Muslim in private sphere, and so this is maybe not connected with this hegemonic Islamophobia that of course is, but maybe it is their own choice that connected with some other factors, I don't know, some other sociological.
Buy the book and read it, and that question will be answered there.
Okay. But maybe in short.
Absolutely, I'm happy to answer it. They're all afraid. For those who did not want to identify, it was out of fear. So it wasn't by choice. It was really by fear. Yeah.
So in all cases.
In all cases except for Ayman.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Ayman, like he said that once he actually mentioned that he was Muslim, but he told people that he was culturally Muslim. And it was just in a mere conversation, and that his school district one day had asked him about, you know, can he help them because they had other students somewhere else, and his response was like, you know, I'm culturally Muslim, but sure, whatever I can help with. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, great.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you.